Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's policy session entitled Moving to Racial Equity in Transportation, sponsored by State Farm. Thank you so much to State Farm for your dedicated support to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and your leadership in supporting our work on transportation equity. Today, we are so very honored to commemorate one of America's greatest heroes and champions of equity and justice, the late, great Congressman Elijah Cummings from the great state of Maryland. Many of you know him for his leadership and advocacy for voting rights, economic opportunity, and civil rights, and his fierce conviction for a just democracy that was put on display every day in his capacity as the chair of the Oversight Committee. He will be forever remembered as the people's champion, a tireless advocate who also served as a senior member on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, always working for marginalized communities, addressing issues of housing discrimination, transportation, and police reform. You will also get a chance today to hear from his wife, Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings, who will reflect on his leadership. Congressman Cummings founded the Transportation Brain Trust at the annual legislative conference over 2 decades ago and worked closely with the Conference on Minority and Transportation officials. He took these issues head on in his home city of Baltimore and across the country. So we are so honored to look and honor him today, as well as look at his issues through the lens of experts in the field and through fearless and brilliant policymakers like Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, representing the great state of Massachusetts, the first woman of color to be elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Congresswoman Pressley serves on the Financial Services Committee and the Oversight and Reform Committee. She's also the co-chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and the founding chair of the Future of Transportation Caucus, a new congressional caucus dedicated to creating a vision for the future of our transportation system and the emphasized equity, access, and state sustainability that our communities need. She was elected to Congress in 2018 and has been making waves across the country, including mobilizing members of Congress through her Transportation Caucus to address the many issues Congressman Cummings was so fiercely passionate about. So we thank you, Congresswoman Pressley, for your outstanding leadership, for carrying the mantle Congressman Cummings carried for so many years, and for never losing sight of the communities in need of justice. And now I'd like to turn it over to Congresswoman Pressley for her remarks.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for that warm and gracious introduction. It is an honor and a pleasure to join you in virtual community today to commemorate my forever chairman, Elijah Cummings. May he rest in power. And to continue the critical work of the Transportation Brain Trust that he started over 20 years ago. It was an honor and a privilege to serve in close proximity and to be mentored by this truth teller and justice seeker who challenged each of us to be decent, to be fair, and to meet the moment with reverence and dignity, even in the face of injustice and indignities. Truly in life, all you have are your name and your word. And when it comes to Elijah Cummings, both were good. For Chairman Cummings, transportation equity was personal for him, just as it is to all of us. Like so many marginalized and low-income folks, his family did not own a car. So in order for him to get to school, he took a bus. When his mom needed to go to work, she took the bus. And when it was Sunday morning and it was time for the family to worship and to head to church, they took the bus. You cannot do the work of equity and racial justice without centering transit. And the chairman lived this and fought for it his entire career. Now, it's not lost on me that the morning of his transition, after he spent decades tirelessly fighting to center transportation equity for all, Representative Takano, Representative Garcia, and I launched the Future of Transportation Caucus to continue this work and to establish a federal policy vision for our transportation system, one which centers equity, access, connectivity, and sustainability for all communities. I also just want to acknowledge that indeed Black lives matter, and so do Black staffers. And I'm especially proud that a young Black man on my staff, Dennis Barrett, has taken the lead on this issue in our office. So it's not lost on me that we launched that caucus on the very day that he transitioned. For too long, marginalized communities have suffered from a lack of affordable, reliable, and safe public transit. This is due to decades of intentional and calculated divestment in our public transportation systems in favor of policies which have prioritized the expansion of roads and highways stretching into higher income suburbs. But in the same way, our policy decisions have centered and created, or rather created, these injustices by not centering the people, by not centering equity and justice. We must now pursue precise, data-driven policies to finally achieve transit equity. Now, across the United States, 45% of people lack access to public transportation, and in my district, the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, one of the most diverse, vibrant, dynamic districts in the country, and one of the most unequal. And that has everything to do with transportation deserts. The 4 neighborhoods with the longest commute times also have the largest populations of low income and overwhelmingly minority residents. In fact, Black public transit riders in Boston spend an average of 64 more hours per year waiting, riding, and transferring buses than white riders. During this pandemic, the neighborhoods in my district that are reporting higher rates of COVID-19 infection are home to a higher proportion of essential workers who rely upon public transportation. So it comes as no surprise that these are the same communities that have been identified as needing the most improvement and investment to their transit systems. The right investments must be made in our communities now, and we should be funding transportation like the public good that it is. Let me be clear. Public transit should be free. And that is why I've introduced a bill that would invest in improving our public transit, making it free, safe, and reliable for all riders. We can't talk about transportation justice without acknowledging and correcting the environmental racism and resulting health disparities caused by increased pollution in our neighborhoods. When cars sit in traffic in our communities, the greenhouse gas emissions and exhaust they release directly harms us all. By giving people the freedom to move freely on public transit, walk safely on sidewalks, and bike on our streets, we can help reduce the environmental harms that have been inflicted on our communities and make our neighborhoods more livable, as well as more connected. As we do the work of undoing generations of systemic racism, we must keep transportation front of mind so that we can finally affirm the right of all to live and move safely, accessibly, and affordably in community. I thank you all again for the opportunity to join you today to commemorate my forever chairman. Together, our work continues.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for your leadership, for your insightful remarks. We appreciate you and what you're doing for our communities and the entire country. So thank you so much. I'd now like to turn it over to Victor Enger, Vice President, Agency Sales with State Farm Mutual Automobile Insurance Companies. And again, thank you, State Farm, for your support, not just of this session today, but really investing in our future leaders of tomorrow, like Dr. Reagan Patterson, our Transportation Equity Fellow, doing outstanding research at the foundation. Victor Enger joined State Farm in 1994 as an agent in Los Angeles, California. He was selected as an agency field consultant in 1997 and regional agency administrative assistant in 1999. In 2001, he was promoted to agency field executive and moved to Bloomington, Illinois, to become agency administrative assistant in 2005 and promoted to assistant vice president, learning and development that same year. He was promoted to executive assistant to the chairman's council in 2006 and the following year assumed the role of vice president of agency sales. He received his bachelor's and MBA degrees from Pepperdine University. And of course, he has also served on our CVCF board of directors from 2013 to 2019. Victor Enger, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Victor Enger. I'm a vice president of agency sales with State Farm Insurance based in Irvine, California. I would first like to commend the CVCF CEO and President Tanya Vesey, the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation leadership team, and all the hardworking staff for making this event possible. On behalf of 88,000 State Farm agents and employees, we are pleased to sponsor the annual legislative conference and privileged to partner with the foundation to inspire leaders through scholarship support, policy research, and our longtime sponsorship of the Communication Internship Program. We are very excited to be the sponsor of this critical panel discussion, Moving to Racial Equity in Transportation. As COVID-19 continues to spread throughout the US, many historical prejudices which African Americans face have been exposed and magnified by the pandemic. Transportation and infrastructure issues are at the forefront of many policy discussions, both locally and nationally. And I believe we can have a meaningful discussion, including those who are shaping their future. As the nation's #1 auto insurer, it is obvious that transportation issues impacting safety are critical to our core business. As a Fortune 40 company known for its commitment to diversity and inclusion in all aspects of our business, transportation equity is important to the success of any D&I strategy. Connecting the many diverse communities within our urban centers is critical to their long-term health and growth. And we at State Farm are looking to do all we can to foster those connections. I would like to thank the members of this esteemed panel for contributing their time and expertise to this important topic. And I look forward to hearing some meaningful dialogue that can lead to effective solutions. And thank you again for the invitation to be a part of this truly special event and honoring the late Representative Elijah Cummings. Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce to you Valerie Jarrett, board member with Lyft. Valerie Jarrett has served as a member of Lyft's board of directors since July 2017. She has served as senior advisor to the Obama Foundation since April 2017 and a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Chicago Law School since January 2018. From January 2008 to 2016, Ms. Jarrett served as senior advisor to President Barack Obama, where she oversaw the Office of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs and chaired the White House Council on Women and Girls. Prior to joining the Obama Foundation, Ms. Jarrett served in various senior positions, including Chief Executive Officer of the Habitat Company, the Chicago real estate development and management firm. She previously was Deputy Chief of Staff for the Mayor of Chicago, served as Commissioner of the Chicago Department of Planning and Development, and chaired the Chicago Transit Board. Ms. Jarrett currently serves as chairperson of the board of directors of When We All Vote, a nonprofit organization, and serves on the board of directors of 2U Inc., an education technology company, and Ariel Investments LLC, a private investment company. I'll now turn it over to Ms. Jarrett for her remarks.
Hello, everyone. I'm just delighted to be with you today to talk about the importance of equity in transportation. I know this has been a really tough year for everyone, as we've been dealing with the effect of the COVID-19 virus threatening our lives and livelihood and that of our friends and family and Americans across our country and across the world. And we've been trying to reconcile the social injustices and racial disparities that have existed in our country for far too long. But I've also been so inspired by many of you in this room today who have committed yourself to improving our society and for fighting for the kinds of ways that we know will improve both our lives and our livelihood. It's also an opportunity for us to honor two men who I knew so well who died this year, who I considered my friends, both Elijah Cummings and John Lewis, congressmen, iconic trailblazers, social justice fighters, men who were committed to closing the racial gaps and making sure that those who did not have a voice had a seat at the table. They knew through John Lewis's words the importance that we not think that democracy is a state, but rather it is an act, and that we should get in some good trouble. And that's what those two leaders did over the course of their two short lives. And so how better to honor them than to pick up the baton and continue the work that is still left to be done. So today I'm here representing Lyft. I joined the board of Lyft a few years ago because I was so drawn by its mission-driven purpose of providing transportation and making it easy in people's lives. At Lyft, we have a unique opportunity to break down the unfair disadvantages that have not received a lot of attention, the unequal access to affordable and efficient transportation. Transportation is key to everything. It's how we get to work, it's how we find a job, it's how we provide for our families, we shop, we vote, we get to healthcare. everything revolves around transportation. And transportation costs are the second largest expense for most Americans, taking down about 20% of every dollar that we make. And for low-income families, our poorest households, it can be up to 55% because we obviously commute much further. Inadequate transportation is a massive barrier to upward mobility and has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 virus, as we know. Already, members of the Black community typically have longer commutes, and Black households in America are more than 3 times as likely to not own a car. Lyft recognizes the impact of inadequate transportation on communities, particularly Black communities, both in access to jobs and working in transportation. So, this unfair distribution of access is part of the reason why we are introducing a new initiative that I am so fortunate to chair called the Lift Up Access Initiative. It's an alliance that is partnering with organizations including the Black Women's Roundtable, the National Urban League, the United Negro College Fund, and many more with whom I know you work so closely, with a shared goal of helping to eliminate transportation as a barrier to upward mobility for Black communities. Together, we will provide access to 1.5 million rides, discounted or donated Lyft rides over the next 5 years, connecting individuals in need to a powerful network of essential resources and services. Together, the Lift Up Access Alliance and its partners will focus on providing the Black community with the means and mobility not only to survive the disproportionate effects of our current pandemic, but to be able to succeed in the world going forward. Meanwhile, we're committed to making sure we provide those who want flexibility and who are interested in providing those who need the flexibility independent work with earning opportunities that they need. The gig economy can be a gateway to independence and self-employment for Black Americans. 96% of Black-owned businesses in the United States are sole proprietorships. Many Black Americans drive Lyft, taking advantage of the flexibility and the earning opportunity that it brings while providing another transportation option in their communities. So as we look to make it through this crisis, and I know we will, we need to make sure everyone has an opportunity to rebound. And that will mean access to safe and available transportation and flexible and available jobs. So I am so glad that you're featuring transportation access on this panel today. These are the inequities that can impact so many lives as we hope to support our families. But these are also the opportunities that we can create if we approach transportation in a thoughtful and meaningful way. So thank you so much. Please stay safe and stay dedicated to this important cause.
All right, we are now ready to get the conversation started. It is my honor to introduce to you a friend of the foundation, a leader in his own right, our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Andre Perry, fellow with the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Perry is a scholar in residence at American University and a columnist for the Hetchinger Report. He's the author of a new book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. He's a nationally known and respected commentator on race, structural inequality, and education, and we are really thankful to have him today. Dr. Perry, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Mena, for that introduction. As we have heard, transportation is critical to the economic and social mobility of families and communities. Uneven transportation access can be considered the very definition of structural inequality. This is why I'm excited to moderate this important discussion. I will be joined by the following panelists: Calvin Gladney, President and CEO of Smart Growth America; Michael McAfee, Dr. Michael McAfee, President and CEO of PolicyLink; Dr. Reagan Patterson, Transportation Equity Research Fellow for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation; Charles Penny, Chief of Transit and Sustainable Transportation for the City of Baltimore; and Destiny Thomas, founder and CEO of Thrivance Group. So I'm going to jump right into it, and I'm going to direct the first question to Calvin. As cities look to smart growth policies for revitalization, what needs to be in place to ensure an equitable transportation system that is accessible and affordable for Black communities? And I want you to explain what smart growth is. It's in the very name of your organization. So if you will, explain what you do and answer that question.
Thank you, Andre. And I just wanted to thank the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for having me and allowing to be on a panel with such august fellow panelists, including all the doctors, of which I am not one. So just glad to be in the room. Like you said, I'm president and CEO of Smart Growth America, and our North Star is to have a country where no matter who you are or where you live, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, that's prosperous, and resilient. And the idea of smart growth is thinking about where you build, who you build it for, and how you build it, and making sure that that is a systems level approach that takes into account all the disciplines that are necessary to create that type of country in that environment. Your question was about creating an equitable transportation system, and I think I'll give kind of three main points there in response. The first is that you have to think about our transportation system as more than just a transportation system. It's a land use system, it's a public health system, and I'm certain Charles is going to get into that. It's a climate change mitigation system, and I'm sure that Reagan will talk about that later. And finally, it's a public health system. So let's not think about transportation in a vacuum. Let's think about highways being built through neighborhoods. And when you put those highways through neighborhoods, that's seen as a transportation system decision, but it actually has land use and community revitalization ramifications. So let's first not just think of the system only in terms of transportation, but in terms of all the other things it affects. The second thing I would say, if you want to make the transportation system equitable, you have to do what I'll call swim upstream. You have to focus on federal policy if you really want to make local level transportation system change happen to the benefit of Black communities. And I'll just give you one example. We could do a whole panel on federal policy alone, but one real example is the federal share of the cost of building out any transportation investment. Right now, 80 to 90% of all road costs, if you're going to build a highway, are paid for by the federal government, and that's by virtue of congressional policy. In contrast, if you're making a public transit investment, which we know would inure to the benefit of many Black and brown communities disproportionately, the feds only pay about 50% of that, those costs. And so as you imagine, it's harder to get public transportation systems built, those investments made in our communities. And so that would be one example of, you have to focus on federal policy, both at the congressional level and at the agency level, if you really want to create an equitable transportation system locally. And then finally, I'll say you have to take, as a third point, you have to take our idea of an equitable transportation system, and I'll channel my best Michael McAfee here. You got to take it from thinking about equity and an equitable transportation system to a transportation system and investments focused on justice, not just equity. And if you think about it, I said, well, the transportation system is a series of systems. It's also either a wealth building system or a wealth extraction system. There's no in between. It's just like racism. Either you're an anti-racist or you're a racist. And in this case, if you think about transportation investments, unless you are making those decisions to the benefit of justice for Black and brown people in terms of all of the ways that transportation was used really to extract wealth from our communities. So unless you have a justice orientation to the transportation system investments, one, you'll never get to equity. And two, it'll almost certainly lead to more extraction from our communities rather than supporting economic opportunity and wealth building for Black folks. So those are my sort of three introductory remarks.
Great. Now I want to throw this at Charles because Calvin mentioned that some federal solutions to funding transportation efforts at a local level. I'm going to ask you this, Charles. What are local and regional transportation agencies doing to fund and sustain public transportation, especially during times of disasters like the one we're in now?
First, let me say thank you for having me again with this distinguished guest panelist here. It's really tough right now because of the pandemic. We were already cash strapped here, for example, Baltimore. I'll speak on what I know. We look at our infrastructure in two different ways. We have our roadways and we have our transit infrastructure as well. I'm in charge of overseeing our transit infrastructure and in charge of overseeing our capital improvement project process. So I definitely understand how the money comes in. The pandemic has had the city, we had about $100 million shortfall in receipts and tax receipts. That's direct revenue that comes to the city. The state, which does a lot of funding of our, which we call highway user revenue funds, which is dedicated funds that come to the city just for transportation, has had about 20% cut in their overall operational budget. So that hits Baltimore City directly. To give you a sense of where we stand from an infrastructure standpoint, we're about $1.5 billion in the hole just to get our system up to speed. It takes about an additional $111 million every year just to do our maintenance of our system. That's systems preservation. Cities like Chicago, $5 billion a year. So the money is definitely, it's a shortfall. And how do we make it work? Unfortunately, we rob Peter to pay Paul. And that's just the unfortunate reality of what we do. To run my system, I was just cut about 20%. So am I still supposed to meet all of my stops, be reliable, pay the operators? Am I still supposed to operate that system in the same way I'm doing today? So cuts have to be made, and it is unfortunate. We try to do the best that we can. We have to get extremely creative with it. We like to sometimes kick the can down the road, and you have to prioritize. But I do want to go back to what Calvin has said, because we don't have a lot of money. So it's really important for us to spend the money in the correct area. We look at equity in everything we do now here in Baltimore City. It actually came as part of legislation from our soon to be Mayor Brandon Scott. And basically equity now has to be a part of everything we do. So we have what's called a transit gap analysis, where we'll look at the entire city and see where our transit deserts are. And it just so happens to be our transit deserts are in areas that are the most Black or brown, have the highest poverty, have no access to cars. And also what's important is connectivity. They have the longest time travel to get to their jobs. If it's taking you 45 minutes to get to your job plus 2 bus transfers, that's not an efficient system. So we have to improve that. Some of the things that we're looking into is using technology for microtransit solutions, because we actually now know where the people are and we know where they're going. We're doing more on-call, more regional kind of smaller areas that we're delivering people from their residence to their jobs, to healthcare providers, to food. All of this is interconnected. We cannot just look at it as just a system to take you from point A to point B. It's so much more entwined than that. So it's really important when we are strapped tight that we're spending the money the most efficiently, that has the biggest bang for our buck. And going back to what Calvin said, as far as the justice is concerned, we call it disenfranchised communities, but it's all in the same vein.
But I just want to follow up quickly.
Yes.
It's almost impossible for just local municipalities and states alone to make up for these deficits. You almost have to have some type of federal response, correct?
We do. That is true. And so the CARES funding does help. And it depends on what kind of system you operate, how that CARES funding has helped. So the CARES funding that's come through Baltimore City, because we run a free transit service operation for the Charm City Circulator, which is what I oversee, that CARES funding has been a godsend, because we don't lose revenue hours per se, because or receipts, because people aren't paying to use our service. It's free. So the money that comes back in just allows us to pay off our revenue hours for our operators who do operate the service. So, but if that CARES funding did not come in, I mean, it very well could have folded. I mean, that's how serious the situation has been with the pandemic. We were already cash strapped. We're already fighting people who want to get rid of services because it doesn't come to their neighborhood, but it goes to another neighborhood. So we're trying to figure out the best way to juggle all of the different interests, all of the needs of the people, which is first and foremost. And yes, it is almost impossible. If my job were any harder, I'd probably grow hair, but here I am.
I'm going to turn now to Destiny Thomas. I think we're all excited about how the local protests are transforming policies at a local level, particularly around criminal justice. But how are current protests and other forms of activism impacting transportation policy and planning?
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you to all of the panelists who are doing such important and impactful work to improve not just access to transportation, but freedom of movement, which is a value that our ancestors, our social justice warriors that came before us really fought to make sure that Black people in particular could keep and carry forward for many generations. I think what we forget about when we talk about transit and transportation planning is that our public realm, our built environment, which is often the streets, is really the backdrop and the stage where police brutality play out. So we can see planning institutions, transportation planning departments as sort of co-conspirators in the harm that Black people are experiencing, not just at the hands of police, but as a result of toxic industry in our communities and other types of environmental and social racism. And I think our protests, the protests that are happening now and the ones that have come before us have focused a lot on rightfully critiquing the role that law enforcement has played in untimely and unjust deaths of Black bodies and Black people. But I think some things we should think about are who the other key players in that harm are. And a lot of times when we talk about things like redlining, we think about developers and the real estate industry, and even sometimes the expansion of freeways as being the things that were the most harmful to us. But there's opportunity for atonement directly within our transportation planning processes and departments. A lot of people a lot of times new transportation infrastructure and innovation happens at the expense of and on the backs of Black communities. And what I mean by that is our major capital funding projects often use these maps that indicate where most of the Black people live, or where there's a lack of access to food, or where there's a lack of access to the economy. We use those maps to justify large amounts of investments and funding in our communities. But what happens is we procure those funds, and those funds are then dispersed around the city, and we get enhanced transit networks and pedestrian networks and bicycle facilities that allow people who aren't in or from the communities to move through them. So we create our own pass-over cities or pass-through cities within cities. And so even in this time where we're thinking and talking about equity and equitable transportation investment, we are still superseding the needs of the communities whose identities and whose harm are justifying those investments. And so I think that our protests today are calling for some important change, and some of the work that we're doing at the Thrive-Ins group is to elevate the types of changes that can come through the transportation sector. And so we actually have what we call a comprehensive package for reparations through urbanism that offers a set of solutions for folks working in the transportation planning sector to try to start to undo that harm and to atone for the legacy of racism in urbanism.
While transportation historically has been used as a weapon against Black communities, it's refreshing to hear that you're using it as a way to elevate and to relieve ourselves from that prior policy violence. I'm going to turn to Reagan Patterson. 2020 marks the 15th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, a place that's near and dear to my heart. I lived there for 14 years. Today, Black communities are facing COVID-19 and an increase in climate change-induced disasters. How is transportation exacerbating this issue, and what are sustainable solutions?
Great. So thank you, everybody. I'm so excited to be on this panel. This is my first panel at ALC, so I'm excited for this opportunity. And so with that question, it's a big question. I want to start by linking this all together. So in August, the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy had 15 days of programming to commemorate 15 years of recovery since Hurricane Katrina. During the course of that, folks in Louisiana were hit by yet another hurricane, Hurricane Laura, while still dealing with all the impacts of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. And when you look at which group was disproportionately negatively impacted by both of these events, both the hurricane and the pandemic, it's Black folks. Early stats showed racial health disparities in Louisiana, with Black people making up 70% of coronavirus deaths, despite only being 32% of the state's population. On top of that, communities like Mossville, Louisiana, and Cancer Alley had to cope with direct damage from Hurricane Laura, as well as chemical leaks from surrounding petrochemical plants. And now these dual threats, they're not unique to Black people in Louisiana. Black communities all across the nation are disproportionately hit by climate change-induced disasters, and they disproportionately face higher rates of infection and death from coronavirus. So then the question becomes, where does transportation fit into this story? Well, first, let's look at the coronavirus pandemic. Several studies have shown the association between exposure to air pollution and increased risk of being infected by or dying from coronavirus. And two pollutants that studies have shown lead to higher COVID-19 death rates are fine particulate matter, PM2.5, and nitrogen dioxide, NO2. These two pollutants themselves cause many adverse health outcomes: asthma, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, which are underlying health conditions that worsen COVID-19 outcomes. And a major source of both of these pollutants, both PM2.5 and NO2, is transportation. And so Black communities are highly exposed to traffic-related air pollution because they're more likely to live in high traffic density areas, including near major roadways and goods movement corridors, port communities, and near bus depots. And this is due to environmental racism. And when I say that environmental racism, I don't just point to the deliberate targeting of Black communities, as was done in the mid-20th century with freeway construction, but also those larger processes that produce racial inequities and exposure, inequities shaped by the legacy of job discrimination and racial residential segregation. So that's coronavirus. And then secondly, when we look at what Dr. Robert Buller calls unnatural disasters, transportation is a major contributor to climate change. This was touched upon by Congresswoman Presley. Climate is one piece that I've been focusing on in my role as the Transportation Equity Research Fellow at the CBCF. So according to the US EPA, transportation accounts for the largest portion of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, 28%. And the majority of transportation greenhouse gas emissions are from light duty vehicles, so cars and trucks. And climate change impacts are here. And as we've observed, Black communities are hit first and worst by climate change. So it's imperative to reduce transportation emissions to address these increased exposures and associated health risks, as well as the increased climate burden on Black communities. But how do we do that? And that's something that we've been trying to answer at the CBCF. Well, I'll share a few ideas that I touch upon in a recent publication for the CBCF. Well, firstly, we need a zero emission vehicle fleet. And this requires standards that accelerate electric vehicle production, as well as leadership. We need government leadership at every level in ramping up the required charging infrastructure. Also, it's important to note, though, that for electric vehicles to truly be zero-emission vehicles, federal and state governments have to commit to carbon-free energy sources of electricity generation and get away from fossil fuels. Additionally, though, we really need to reimagine a transportation system that shifts away from privately owned single occupancy vehicles. For example, when you look at these emerging mobility options, such as shared mobility and autonomous vehicles, a sustainable model relies on those fleets being high occupancy electric vehicles that supplement public transit. Which brings me to my last point, and has been discussed throughout this conversation already. A truly sustainable solution is investing in free and accessible public transit. After listening to Mr. Penny, this is clearly the opposite of the current trend of disinvestment during the pandemic. But really, free and accessible transit is how you redress the failed legacy of the transportation policies and infrastructure that has entrenched an automobile-dominated transportation system and negatively impacted the Black.
You know, we're having a little difficulty, so I'm actually going to transition to Michael McAfee, a policy link at this time. You know, one of the things that complicates Reagan's comments is that in terms of jobs, the transportation sector is an area where Black people are highly concentrated in. And so this is why I want to really turn to Michael, who can speak to the equity issues in this matter. Michael, what role does racial equity in transportation play in creating healthy communities, and equitable economy, and an overall just society?
Thanks for the question, Andre. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I mean, racial equity, achieving justice, a just society, that's the work for our generation. That is the work for our time. You don't get to the recommendations that Dr. Patterson shared, that Charles shared, the insights that Brother Penny gave us, or that Dr. Thomas shared, if you don't center Black folks. I mean, the reality is, when I was born, the highway came straight through my neighborhood. So exactly what Charles was talking about, we moved because of that. And Raj Chetty's data that builds off of years and years of work of local advocates already shows us that still your zip code is the primary driver for how long you live and for how well you live. So we already know those things. But there's something within racial equity that we've got to reckon with, which is this hierarchy of human value. We don't value Black lives. And so it's really hard to have a planning conversation when we don't talk about valuing Black lives. It's what you talk about in your book, Brother Perry. I mean, the reality is, Charles, you talked about land use. And I think racial equity is about land use, because land use is about design. And if we're going to create a just and fair society, we've got to be talking about equity by design. What does it look like to design an infrastructure, a public goods suite of infrastructure that is designed to connect people to opportunity? That's the question that we should be thinking about. In this moment of calamity, we should actually be thinking about, how do we reimagine our cities so that they do just that? But that requires a lot of work. It starts with requiring that you center the thing that you've never wanted to love. Black folks, you center the thing. And then that you want to reckon with what you designed to actually give you the infrastructure that we currently have that actually doesn't work for the results that we want. And this is an important conversation to have, because as we get more educated and sophisticated and want to be fancy, you can't talk about return on investment, scale, and then tell me that you're not going to have the federal government be involved. This works against all that philanthropic investment that folks want to make. You're wasting money, because all we're doing is providing a momentary respite and never really reimagining what this nation can be. And so we've got to hold that tension right now, that this is not a poor nation. We just found trillions of dollars that we put out in ways that did not work for folks. Folks lied and said that opportunity zones was going to help us. It did not. We tried to put several new efforts out there like PPP. It missed small businesses. These are not political statements. These are results-based statements around, do you want to be accountable for the precious resources that we extract from taxpayers? And right now we're not. We use the name of Blackness to get the resources, and then we do what the hell we want with them. And so for right now, what I believe we got to do in order is, you've got the solutions. Brilliant colleagues are sharing what those are. But the consciousness that needs to be embodied in the leadership is the path forward to get there. The consciousness embodied in the leaders, and us actually remaking our institutions so that they will serve, that they'll serve Black folks, that they'll serve poor people.
We have to learn how to center Black folk. That was an excellent commentary. And I'm going to now pose some questions to all the panelists. And I want to center Black folk in this regard. There are transportation is an asset in Black communities. There are great transportation hubs where there are concentrations of Black folk. How can we invest in those assets in ways that can increase jobs and as well as access to quality jobs moving forward? And so I'm going to ask for any of the panelists to take that question.
One of the things about transportation hubs or mobility hubs, which are common now planning mechanisms or efforts, is the problem is that we don't own it, right? And so just like, our aspiration was single family home ownership a while ago, there are way too many opportunities for racism to move in and through that system and that process. And what we're seeing with mobility and transportation is similar. And so one of the ideas or concepts that we're working on is called a cooperative mobility hub model, where anytime these big tech industry players come into communities and want to test out a new micro mobility thing or add a feature to the existing transit, the community itself has stakeholdership, fiscal, and also design-based stakeholdership in the solutions that are showing up in the community. And what that does is it creates a community-based planning process, and it makes the intervention itself sustainable practice that can live in the community and serves as an anti-displacing mechanism so that folks aren't seeing these new investments and innovations as improvements that are meant for folks other than the people who currently live there. And so I think ownership of innovation when it comes to transportation is just as important. And I think another way we get to that ownership is by changing barriers to entry and eligibility requirements for technical planning staff in the transportation field. And so I myself didn't discover transportation planning as a discipline until I was done with my master's degree, which other students who, you know, have had access to power and privilege were raised to know that planning is a sector and planning is a field that goes hand in hand with development and real estate. I just didn't have that insight. And so I came into planning, I stumbled into planning while looking for solutions to Tamir Rice and to Oscar Grant and to Sandra Bland. I found planning that way. And I realized once I got in the building, being the first Black woman hired to be a transportation planner in the city of Los Angeles in 23 years, I realized that this field is intentionally keeping certain folks out. And that is why we don't get to shape what our communities look like from a mobility standpoint. And I would argue that mobility is a key pillar of dignity, and dignity, the stripping of our dignity has been one of the primary mechanisms of racism and slavery, to be honest, in this country. And so if we are really talking about atoning for the legacy of racism and slavery in this country, we have to think about how we restore dignity as it relates to freedom of movement. Only way to do that is to share ownership and stakeholdership through those design and investment processes.
Ooh, I love that. Calvin, you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I'm actually going to add two more components of ownership to what Destiny said, because I was going to go in the same direction. It's not only that we want to own the transportation innovations, we also need to and must own the land that's adjacent to the transportation investments. Because if you own the land, you gain power over what transportation investments are made by that adjacency and that agency. And secondly, we need to own and control the businesses that are in those communities that also are adjacent to the transit investments. The value, I mean, if you think about transportation investments and our system as a potential wealth building exercise for Black communities, we need to own the land and own the businesses that can reap the benefits of those transportation investments. Otherwise, the impacts will really be of value to those who use the transportation to get to and fro through our communities, rather than the transportation investments benefiting directly our communities. So we need to be the owners of the businesses and the land, in addition to the actual investments themselves.
Charles, I want to turn to you around this point. How are public or government entities leveraging Black and Brown creators in ways that advances transportation and wealth in communities?
That's a tough question. You know, I can only speak to what we're doing here in Baltimore. And different agencies are responsible for leveraging of different resources. But from a mobility, I will say, going back to the mobility and the ownership, because there is a lot of that we're here doing here in Baltimore that kind of addresses Destiny's issues. When it comes to mobility, I'm in charge of our dockless vehicle operation. And we have requirements for our providers who come in, be it the Birds or the Limes, that we have these equity zones, and that they have to, in the morning and throughout the course of the day, monitor the amount of vehicles that are actually located in these areas. Now, sometimes you'll get pushback, oh, well, we don't want these vehicles vandalized, or we don't want this or that. And it's a non-negotiable. The vehicles are going in these communities because these individuals need the dignity to get to work. They have to have that option to get to work. So it's a non-negotiable. And if they don't like it, they don't have to.
So I just want to be clear that the calculus, something like what do you hear about a Starbucks or another organization making a determination whether or not to go to a Black community? Are they saying like these scooters and things like that, we're not going to go in Black communities or Black neighborhoods?
They'll use excuses. I won't go as far as to say we're not going into Black neighborhoods. We never gave them the chance to not to.
Okay.
That's the reality. They're going to go into the neighborhoods that need to be served. They're going to go in the neighborhoods that have actually been disenfranchised and disinvested in. And that, again, is a non-negotiable. You don't have to do business here. There's always somebody else who will come in here and who's willing to do business with us and understand the needs that we have. We own the right of way. And so we have to be more forceful with these companies, and we can't run in fear and say, oh my gosh, we lost a company. That's not, we aren't beholden to them. And we can empower the community. We have we require them to get more engaged with the community. There's requirements that they go out to the communities and that they go to community events to not just promote their vehicles, but promote their company, to get them involved in things like transportation planning. I really want to touch on that because I too stumbled into transportation planning. And what I do is a lot of mentoring, a lot of volunteering to the younger students, to let them know when they walk outside, that environment, everything around them is for a reason. It was there, it's built for a reason, and they have to understand what that reason is and what the logic is behind, you know, that sidewalk being right there, that curb cut being right there, that ADA accessible ramp being right there. There's so much of their world that they just don't understand was built there for a reason. And they have to see it coming from a person such as me, so they can understand that they too can be in this position. But I will say also on the flip side, I have gone to communities, and when we talk about ownership of the land adjacent to the mobility hubs that we put into our equity zones. So we do, you know, we're on a tight budget. So what do? We just put some paint on the sidewalk and say, please park your scooter here. There's no fixed infrastructure, but it's next to a business. We talk to the business. We let them know why we're here. We let them know why it may help their business. But sometimes we get pushback. We do get pushback and say, oh, you're only building that for the white people. You're only building that, it's gentrification. You know, you weren't doing this before. We have a struggle for so long. For so long, it's been important for us to get a car because that was our dignity and that was our mobility. And now we're going to complete streets, and now we're going to bike lanes, and now you want to take away my car that I've worked my entire life to get, right? So what's going on here? Which is it? And so these are conversations that we also have to have. When I have a Black person tell me they don't ride a bike, I say, well, I ride a bike with my daughter all the time. It's a great experience, and you too should try that because we all can ride our bike, and we all need to be safe as we ride our bikes. But there's just a lot of elements here, and I'll stop now to let other people chime in on some of these comments that I've made. There's a lot that comes into play here. It's so complex and nuanced, but it is important to have a person like me who's in this position to actually execute that. Because when you go to private firms, and I've worked at private firms, the engineers who may be white, when they go to do their recruiting, they're always going back to Penn State or Virginia Tech. They're going to get people that look like them by no fault of their own. It's probably just what they know. They're not actively thinking, I have to go to Morgan State to get my next engineer. So that's, it's everywhere. It's entrenched, it's ingrained, it's everywhere. And I'll stop.
Well, they should go to Fisk. They should go to Fisk University to get their Black engineer. I just want to put that out there.
Wow. Can I just add, I wanted to add two things to this idea of what, and Charles is doing it, how governments can lead on this point. One gets back to Destiny's point about dignity, and it gets to Charles' discussion of how you have to have these conversations with folks to have them understand why these investments are actually to their benefit. And I think one thing that happens, and I stumbled upon planning, I'm not a planner, I just play one on TV or on Zoom calls, is that we go to a community at the moment of investment, rather than starting a series of discussions about their history, about what has happened to them, and giving them the dignity of the moment to tell their story before we talk about what we're about to do or not do in their community. So I think that's one thing that government agencies can do, maybe even a little better, is to go there before we're talking about the complete streets investments, and as you guys know, we run the National Complete Streets Coalition, so this is near and dear to my heart. The second thing I would say is there is an entrepreneurial ecosystem that is funded by these mobility companies. And as long as you allow them not only to not go to Black neighborhoods, but they hire and invest in a series of service providers that allow them to do what they do. So as a government entity, you can say, well, tell me who are the subcontractors on your mobility investments around our city, and maybe give them some goals. 20% of the businesses that they contract to provide, scooter services around your city have to be through Black and brown entrepreneurial businesses. So I think that's another leverage point that we can leverage more to allow Black and brown entrepreneurs to break into the ecosystem, because a government entity requires that. Because otherwise, just like they only go to Penn State, they're only going to go back to their boys and their girls who they know, who look like them, and not hire our companies, even though we have the same technical expertise.
I'm going to turn to Michael McAfee on this issue, what governments can do, because you've been involved in efforts to compel city leaders to perform equity initiatives. Can you describe the challenges in that? And if in your work, have you challenged cities to develop more equitable transportation systems? And if so, what has been the response?
Well, I'll give you an example. Chicago has done a good job on some of the opportunity side. I'll say that. The North Lawndale Employment Network, I'm on the board of that organization, runs an amazing program where returning citizens are coached up on how to take the licenses and certifications, how to get the ones that are necessary to actually work on the trains, on the subway. It's a powerful way to move folks into the middle class. And so what I would say there is, I've seen a city decide that it was going to remove a bunch of barriers for returning citizens so that they could actually enter those union jobs, because you know how hard of a fight that is. But that actually came from local advocates doing that work and pushing that and compelling the city to actually do that type of work. So I've seen the benefits of watching people go from struggling, even making below minimum wage, to making over $100,000 a year, working on those cars, simply because there was a community-based organization that invested the time to help them be able to learn how to take the test and get the certifications that were necessary. So I see that as a really good opportunity to move into this work. There's a real threat to racial equity and the justice work that we're doing now. Folks are saying you can't do the training, you can't do the consciousness raising right now. That's a real threat, and we need to be mindful of it, because folks are now pushing back. But I don't know how you transform systems if you don't understand the origin story. How can you transform a system if you will not understand its origin story? That's why our institutions are suffering. Now, what I can tell you is, what we're talking about Fairfax County, or what Charles is talking about that is equity in practice, saying you can go someplace else. This is our standard. I'm seeing municipalities be courageous all around the country. The problem is, most of that courage is coming from people of color who don't have the political connections and the networks to survive it. And so we need dangerous leaders in institutions, but we also have to be able to support these leaders so that they can survive being courageous. It is a tough gauntlet to run. And whether I'm talking about stuff in Jackson, Mississippi, or God knows where else, I'm seeing it all over the country. And my biggest fear is these folks don't have the cover that they need and the support that they need to be able to weather being so courageous. And so that's why I'm hopeful, because there are folks who are not afraid of us, who are getting into these roles and want to do liberating work. That's the least of our worries. Our challenge now is to figure out, how do we manage the politics of giving each other cover and support to survive doing liberating work?
Wow.
How do we actually hold electeds accountable regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum, for doing what we should be demanding that they do. And the reason why this is so important is because increasingly I'm seeing even in California, where electeds who you would think would care about these issues are choosing not to want to be really down for these issues. And so I see a movement infrastructure now that is sophisticated and robust around this country that can hold electeds accountable. Feel good about that. I see leaders of color getting into positions and using that privilege to lead in courageous ways, and they need cover. And then we need institutions like PolicyLink to keep pushing with advocates to help people understand that if you want to use the language of systems and systems transformation and all this fancy language, that you must reckon with the origin story so that you can actually enact a different possibility.
Well, I'm going to turn to Reagan. That was absolutely powerful. I have a couple questions for Reagan. One, you talked about environmental racism and the issues related to that. One, where do we need to invest to ensure that transportation moving forward does not exacerbate those inequalities? And also, as the fellow for the CBCF, transportation fellow, how did you get into planning, and how does representation matter in the process?
Great question. So I guess since multi-part, I'll start with the parts around how can transportation mitigate these environmental impacts. And so one thing that I hope was heard was I'm really a proponent for public transit, free and accessible public transit. So again, Charles talked about the struggles that cities face with public transit. However, that's really the way to redress the failed legacy. We see that the struggle for transit started with public transit access, right, with segregated public transit. It is this long lineage of a struggle for Black people to have access to public transit and to have it be accessible from both a perspective of mobility, but also a perspective of economic mobility, because it was the design of public transit to keep us out of certain places and keep us out of certain opportunities. And also it was to the environmental detriment of our communities by investing in roadways, highways, as opposed to public transit. And so for me, we really need to shift away from this automobile dominated transportation system and put investment more so into public transit. And so that's really where you see these, to be able to combat environmental racism from both the planning side and the environmental emissions side. And then to your next point about how did I get into this work, for me, I got my PhD in environmental engineering from UC Berkeley. And so from there was from the air pollution side. I was doing this modeling work on looking at how do transportation policies impact near roadway exposures, looking at EJ communities. And so I went to school at UC Berkeley, and so my focus was Oakland, looking both at West Oakland, which is dealing with roadways, highways, and the rail, and then also looking at East Oakland, which is adjacent to a highway where all of the port trucks have to go through, because Highway I-580 is the only national highway in the country that bans trucks. And that was a decision made by differential access to power, right? You have predominantly white communities in the hills that were able to advocate for no trucks on that highway. So they all go on 880. Who lives in the flats of Oakland? Black and brown communities. And so I got into this work by saying, well, what are these underlying processes that lead to these disparate exposures to air pollution? And so that led me to this position at CBCF, looking at transportation equity, because it needs a more intersectional approach. I had the engineering technical side of air quality modeling, but that's just one component of it, the air emissions and the environmental component. But you start to see that it's all interconnected. This legacy of racism and environmental racism is just one component of racism. And so I started to wonder, what are the other ways in which transportation intersects the lives of Black communities? And so that's really what brought me to this work.
But also speak to that, again, I just want to put an exclamation point on why representation matters, because if we're not in that room, if we're not, no one's going to care about the folks in Oakland and the Black community. So I'm answering my question, but To speak on why representation matters in this sector.
So representation matters. It was touched upon also earlier, I think by Destiny, by just having the voices in the room. And so we talked about high level a lot with the people who are the planners, are the engineers, but also people who are the voices of the community. But then also one thing that we haven't yet talked about are the people who are getting these contracts. And so it's the whole transportation, I would say, it's not pipeline, but the whole transportation holistically. We need people in the room that sign the checks, that are making the decisions, but we need people in the room who feel these impacts in communities. And we need the people in the room to advocate for local hiring practices. As Calvin mentioned, 20% or having some percentage that requires to go to disadvantaged businesses. And so it's making sure that our voices are represented on every component of transportation, both the decisions and the contracting, so that they don't have those negative impacts on Black communities. And so that you don't have where one community can say, oh, you're not gonna put a highway here, and another community is just left to get everything dumped on them. Again, another term that is thrown around a lot is dumping grounds or sacrifice zones. So to make sure that our communities don't become that, because we are not on every level in the transportation planning process.
Charles, you're with the city of Baltimore.
Yes.
You talk about, and you hear a lot about gentrification and its impacts all across the city. How, in different cities, how is gentrification and demographic shifts impacting access to transportation? And in particular, as Black people are moving outwards, is that impacting bus routes, train routes, and other transit things?
The routes, no. The features of the land use features, the treatment features of the roadways, what you see, yes. Unfortunately, what I've found here is the squeaky wheel gets oil. And the loudest community, which is typically the most organized community, which is typically a community that is white, will be the one who gets all of my attention, because I am being hounded by elected officials or whatever it may be to address an issue that needs to be addressed, but it's still taking attention away from, when we think about equity or justice, as Calvin is saying, me really devoting my time in a community that really has had nothing. So if I'm always hearing a community that's organized and that has access to elected officials, that has connections, and this is just the truth. It takes away valuable time, and I only have so much time in the day. So, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying stuff like that, but the reality is when people are organized, they get better results. So what our communities need more of is better organization. Now I try to, when I go out, I talk to them about being organized, and I tell them how they can directly reach me and how they can directly reach individuals with all my staff. But the reality is when I leave, if I leave, they still need to have access. They still need to have that infrastructure that's established and created amongst them within the community, so they can get everything that is needed of their community. That's the gentrification I don't see necessarily as much. It's slow to come. It has happened in Baltimore. It does, and when the gentrification happens, you will see infrastructure investments. And I think that typically from my anecdotal experience is because of the organization of that community. And it's not to say other communities of color don't care, but my mom worked 2 to 3 jobs growing up. There was only so much time in the day she had on top of dealing with my knucklehead self and my older brother. There's only so much time in the day that she
had. Wealth buys you time. It gives you the discretionary time to get
involved. Right. Yeah. And so that's kind of what I've seen anecdotally. Now I have doctors on here who are much smarter, who have data to say what the realities of it are, but that's just what I've seen anecdotally.
Calvin, I want to turn to you on this very issue. Gentrification is something that you hear community members talk about in most cities. How does this impact transportation planning, and what are you doing about it with its smart growth at your organization?
I guess you haven't heard my talk. Everything you know about gentrification is half right.
Well, give us the short abbreviated version.
Well, one is, and this always starts a little debate, gentrification is not the problem. Displacement is the problem.
Displacement.
Wealth extraction is the problem. Not being able to capture the value is the problem. In and of itself, new people and folks with different incomes and different demographics come into the neighborhood is not a problem in and of itself if the people who are in the neighborhood can benefit from whatever comes next, they can get the value of whatever comes next, and they have the choice to stay. So that's, I think, one thing.
So if people own businesses, homes, then they're not complaining about new people coming.
If you spend any time in Washington, D.C., if you go to U Street and you go to Ben's Chili Bowl, and you see Ben's Chili Bowl is now offering turkey burgers and veggie burgers, but they're still there. Gentrification's happened all around it, but it owned its building. So as an owner, it was able to stay. Nobody's gonna raise the rent and then kick them out. And then it was able to change its service profile and its products to be able to benefit from everybody who came. So it's not the gentrification that's the problem, it's the displacement and not being able to leverage and being able to stay. The second thing I'll say is a little bit of the reverse of your original question to Charles, which is oftentimes it's the infrastructure and the transportation investment, which is the catalyst and the snowball effect that creates the gentrification, not the reverse. So once you see the yellow lines being painted, once you see the impermanent temporary bike lanes happening and then the permanent bike lanes happening, once you see the sidewalk investments happening, that usually is the canary in the coal mine that tells the real estate developers, who are typically white, who've always owned that land, legacy from families, to now make investments in that land. You can see that whole story, and this is why history is important, in the H Street corridor in Washington, D.C. All of that land was owned by a bunch of old white guys, some of which are my friends, for many, many years. And it wasn't until the District of Columbia fixed the sidewalks and put in new street lamps that suddenly there was a domino effect. This was before there was the idea of streetcar. I was buying and flipping single family houses as an individual developer at that same time. And I saw all these little infrastructure investments happening, and folks said, oh, well, now's a good time to fix up my row house and sell it, or to sell it to somebody. And that's when developers started the multi-year process of changing the zoning so they could do multifamily development 5 years later. So I think a lot of it is, we have to not just, as Black folks, we can't just plan for the plan, we need to plan for the economics and understand that once the planning process is happening and these infrastructure investments are happening, we have to get on the bandwagon to be ready to leverage what's next. And so one of the things we're trying to do is, once we're in a planning process and we're trying to create input or create a new plan, the question isn't just, do you get input on the plan, but are you giving people the wherewithal, the capacity, and the knowledge to prepare themselves for what's next? So are you talking to the Black and brown businesses, not about what's in the plan, but what can they do now to have the capacity, the capital, and the customer base to benefit from what's going to happen 3 to 5 years later? Are you helping the homeowners and the renters in that area be prepared to either go from renting to owning so they can own that house? And so when a lot of the houses on Capitol Hill, H Street, in Harlem, in parts of Brooklyn, in Oakland, I used to live in Oakland, right around Lake Merritt. A lot of those homes were rented by African Americans, and then as the infrastructure and transportation investments happened, they were not allowed to get the benefit because they were not owners. So a lot of it is not just planning for the plan, but helping Black and brown folks think about the economics and the benefits that are coming and be ready to capture them. And some of that has to be the government mandating things and providing some of those resources. And some of it is, for us, by us, to coin a term, to make sure that we are prepared and that we're working with each other to be prepared for what's next.
Destiny, I want you to just pick up on that and speak to how demographic shifts impacts transportation policy from your perspective at Thrivens?
Sure. So one thing that's important to point out is the double-edged sword that is transportation investment. We actually track and study the connection between transportation and the link between transportation investments and displacement and houselessness. And I can guarantee, I'm willing to bet $1 million in any major metropolitan, you can trace who and track who our curbside community is by the transit network. In Oakland, our tent city is beneath the freeway. It is adjacent to the transit network. Same thing in Los Angeles. I live in both cities. And so transportation planning and investment is a marker for displacement and houselessness, especially in Black communities. And that's a point that I don't want to be missed. The reason that this happens is because you can't do transportation planning in a vacuum. There are so many compounding impacts of oppression and systems of oppression that created the dynamics that we're living within, that it's not enough to just plan a network. You have to also plan a safety net and all of the other things that go into resolving disparity and oppression attached to that transit network. The other thing that is missing from this conversation is, I love Dr. King's quote that, you know, he was fearful that he didn't want to integrate us into a burning house. And that's how I feel about transportation planning, because even with the best circumstances, with the most up-to-date infrastructure, we still have Dijon Kizzy being shot in the back 7 times by the police department, and that being documented as his fault because of his inability to comply with local bicycle code, which I didn't even know existed, and I'm a planner in this city. We still have Nia Wilson being sliced to death on BART by a white supremacist. Because of her killing, I now know how to board a train and survey that train for potential threats. I know which exit I need to sit by. I know who I feel safe sitting by when I get on there. I know who else is vulnerable in case things really pop off and I need to support. I have to have this duality, this double consciousness just to move around. It is not as simple as investment and innovation and access. We have to deal with the structural implications of asking Black people to become more visible, to become walkers and bikers and transit users. We have to indict the systems that make that a scary and threatening possibility for so many people.
Wow, I mean, so much there. I want to turn to Michael on this because she dropped so much wisdom there.
Yeah, follow that, Michael.
But this, you can't do transportation policy alone. What are some of the other areas that you most certainly have to work on in order to see transportation take off? I'm going to put that to Michael, a policy link.
Land use. We need to be deeply involved in the long-term plans for how cities are going to grow and evolve. Those conversations are already happening. By the time we see buildings, we're already 10 years too late. And so we've got to make sure that our advocates and others actually know how to get into these processes and how to fight for what they want. I think that's the first thing. I think the second is, quite frankly, going back to the federal government, I think we actually need to reimagine how competitive dollars are distributed. Imagine if that formula is really just about warm bodies and census and demographic data. But imagine if that allocation was around municipalities that were actually doing the things that we're talking about. There hasn't been a refresh on that since its inception of those competitive dollars, but that's part of the problem, because municipalities can take in these billions of dollars and they actually don't have to do anything. Think about affirmatively furthering for housing. Long before it was dismantled, it wasn't even adhered to. When I spent 11 years at HUD, and so I know local folks could care less about it, even though they had signed a legally binding certification that they would not do anything, they would not discriminate, and that they would actually really try to affirmatively further fair housing. And so to me, it starts with us really beginning to think about the design of our cities, the land use policies, where our community is going to be located, et cetera, and to really play in that. A good example is Bridge Housing, in largest affordable housing developer on the West Coast, beginning to make a transformation from saying, what does it mean for us just to stop producing units and actually think about designing communities, communities for people of color, communities for folks who work every day, but still can't afford to live in the Bay. And so that's where I think we have to start. I mean, where all the things that you're hearing us all say is absolutely right. And that's what makes this so daunting, because it all has to happen and it all needs to happen at the same time. And so for me, you know, it was interesting to see the APA, after we've been going back and forth with them for the American Planning Association for years, finally embed equity in the planning governing documents. That's a huge leap forward. It's insufficient, but it's a huge leap forward. But that's also a big result of us getting more of us into the APA and making that happen. And so I think that that's why representation matters. And I think this is where some of the stuff that we have to do, people may not think that it's sexy, but it is the most powerful stuff. It's the stuff that we do not see. And it's the stuff, like Destiny was saying, we often don't know about, that we need to start knowing about. How do cities really run? How does the planning process really work? Who decides where the next development is going to go? How does a community advocate? I live off of 580 in the hills that you're describing, and I'm like, wow, I wondered why I never see trucks and it's always packed, like 880, right? Like, we need to know that. How do you make that happen? That is a new level of sophistication that we need to bring. So the last thing I would say is this. When we think about civil society's role in all this work, this is the type of new infrastructure that is needed. This type of brilliance that you're hearing here about strategy doesn't have an infrastructure that can support it for the most part. You don't have the institutional capacity to support it. You've got the smart folks out there, but they really, many of them don't have an organization that wants to advance this work. So the last thing I would say is I think we need to think about, if we want to do this work around planning, designing of our cities, we need to think about what is the ecosystem that is needed, that needs to be built up around it to advance this type of agenda, the same way we think about ecosystems in terms of business.
You know, in the closing minutes, we have about 7 minutes left. I'm going to ask you all the same question, and it's one of these questions you always get at the end of an event. If you could pick one policy, one federal policy, one federal recommendation to add to the upcoming infrastructure bill that we keep saying is going to come, what would it be? And I'm going to start with the practitioner in the House, Charles Penny, who's at the City of Baltimore.
You know, because I'm an implementer, I just want them to pass the bill. It's like I'm at a point right now where I'm so exhausted that it's not even, I can't even imagine what the greatest thing is. I just want them to get the simplest thing done. The most simplest thing done so I can do my job, you know, and represent and fulfill the needs of the citizens of Baltimore. I'm just pass a bill. I mean, that's that simple.
So I'm going to go to Reagan at this point. If you could advise for the upcoming infrastructure bill, how would the Congressional Black Caucus Transportation Fellow respond?
One thing that I want to see is a shift away from this 80-20 financing between highways and public transit infrastructure. And so I would want to see...
Explain that.
Okay, so what we see time and time again with all of our infrastructure and transportation bills are that 80% of national funding supports highways of the funds allocated and appropriated versus 20% goes to public transit. And so I'm hoping that eventually we start to see a change in that and hopefully a complete reversal. We see them increasing the amount of money going to public transit, but we don't see the proportion of money increasing. And so hopefully the proportion of federal dollars allocated to public transit can go up.
Michael McAfee of Policy Link, how would you advise folks putting together the transportation or the infrastructure bill?
I would love to see opportunity metrics around it and have the money to tie to delivering on those metrics. You heard us give all sorts of examples, whether it's local hire, workforce development, contracting, all sorts of things, designing places that actually connect people to opportunity. I would like to see real strong accountability standards that are in the statute, not just the legislation, that require you to meet a certain threshold or you don't get the money.
Wow. Destiny of Thrivance. How are you going to advise this infrastructure bill?
I would like to see the incorporation of a mandate that prioritizes and privileges Black communities being the first recipients of long range and deep range planning efforts. And so that would prohibit cities from doing quick build projects like striping bike lanes on top of roadways that haven't been reconstructed in 40 years, which have toxic public works infrastructure beneath them. So I would like to start to see cities doing transportation planning in conjunction with other public works and environmental justice planning efforts, so that we're not just getting quick fixes that don't serve our wellness and ability to thrive in the long term.
Very good. Now, Calvin, of Smart Growth, please advise the Congresswoman Presley on the infrastructure bill.
It's hard going last when you got all the rock stars going before you. It's going to sound similar to Michael. I'll just go a little farther. It's make it mandatory that we measure what's important, and then we quantify whether they're hitting those metrics or not. A couple of examples, and this will relate to things that a bunch of folks said. Reagan spoke earlier that 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation industry, which makes transportation the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, which means it's the biggest creator of climate change and climate change effects. Right now, no state is required to quantify how much vehicle miles traveled happen based on their investments, which means there's no way to track whether the money we're sending for transportation investments is exacerbating climate change or not. That's one. Two would be to measure whether the transportation investments are increasing access to jobs and opportunity as by virtue of those investments. Right now, folks can build roads that just really make it easier to get to your next spa appointment, but not easier to get to a job center. So having in the legislation measurable metrics around economic opportunity being increased by those transportation investments. So that's climate change, that's economic opportunity. And then finally, have a metric in the legislation about racial justice. Are these transportation investments undoing the historic wrongs that have happened to Black and brown communities, and particularly on a systemic level basis to Black folks? Are those transportation investments undoing those injustices and promoting equity, or they're not? But unless you mandate in the legislation that that is tracked and that there's metrics involved in assessing whether those investments are changing the game or exacerbating the game, it won't happen. So making it mandatory that you measure and have metrics for the things that are important.
Wow, that was incredible. And I have the pleasure and the difficulty of trying to close this out before I turn it over to Dr. Mena. I just wanted to say thank you all for your brilliance and your wisdom on this issue. For me, transportation is much more than getting on a bus or driving a car. It's a metaphor for me for our advancement as a community. And if we do not advance our transportation systems in ways that benefit Black folk and our quest towards freedom, then we won't be free. This is such a critical component of our livelihood. So, and it must be a critical component of our movement. And so I just want to thank all of you for providing leadership in this area, because it's desperately needed for the benefit of all of us. I'm going to turn it over at this time to Dr. Mena, who is going to introduce a special guest at this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry, and awesome, awesome, awesome. I have learned so much today, and I'm sure everybody tuning in has. You guys are fire. And I appreciate your insight. We want to thank State Farm again for supporting. This is what we do. We want all of you tuning in, get to know the names of these people, come reach out to us at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. There is work to do. I am going to quote Dr. Destiny Thomas about the double consciousness to literally and figuratively move around. That's very deep. And this is a really intersectional issue that touches us every day of our lives. We can't do what we do without our health. We can't do what we do without the ability to move around. And so it is a tool of empowerment, not just mobility. So thank you all for that. I also want to thank our distinguished moderator, Dr. Perry. Thank you for leading a great discussion. And with that, yes, giving you fingers there and applause. So with that, I would like to introduce Rocky Cummings, founder and president and CEO of Global Policy Solutions, a DC-based policy firm that makes policy work for the people and their environments. She's a former adjunct professor in the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and she also served as the chair of the Maryland Democratic Party, vice president of research and programs at the CBCF. She actually created the Center for Policy Analysis and Research, where Dr. Patterson and I work. She is a senior resident scholar at the National Urban League, chief of staff to Congressman Charles Rangel. These are positions she held in her past, and also worked on the House Ways Committee. As a CBCF legislative fellow in the office of Congressman Mel Watt, she also conducted much of her research and is a well-known political scientist as well. She's a noted speaker and author. She's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, among other outlets, and her expertise include health, social insurance, income security, education, women's issues, and youth participation. You name it, she's been there working hard on these issues, and is the author of the Political Action Handbook, a how-to guide for the hip-hop generation. She's also co-editor of Strengthening Community, Social Insurance in a Diverse America, among many other articles and chapters she's written. She has devoted her career to closing racial, socioeconomic, and gender disparities to create opportunities for everyone. And so now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings for her closing remarks in commemoration of Dr. Elijah Cummings, Congressman Elijah Cummings, still a doctor in his own right, given all that he's done in his entire career, a champion for change, equity, and advancement for transportation equity for all of us. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings.
Hello, I'm Maya Rockeymoore Cummings, and I'm very pleased to bring closing greetings to you today on behalf of my late husband, Congressman Elijah Cummings, who used to host these sessions on transportation equity at the annual legislative conference of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. So today's session on moving to racial equity in transportation was very near and dear to my late husband's heart because of his upfront and personal experiences with the importance of, or the lack thereof, access to quality public transportation, particularly in major cities like Baltimore around the country, but also in rural areas. And for Elijah, this was personal. As a child, he had to take sometimes 2 and 3 buses just to get from his home to the school that he attended. And today, the children of Baltimore actually have to take buses, public transportation, in order to get to the places that they need to go. But it wasn't just about kids. It was about adults who needed transportation to get to jobs, to get to places, certainly where they needed to shop and get their essentials for life. I mean, transportation is so central, Elijah believed, to the life of people in inner cities, particularly those who can't afford personal automobiles, that he took it on as a personal priority. He worked for 10 years to get something called the Red Line in Baltimore City. Now, the Red Line was a project that was supposed to actually bring equity of opportunity, particularly to people of Baltimore's west side, who didn't necessarily have access to the places and spaces where the job creation growth was happening in the region. And so the Red Line was supposed to solve that problem while also bringing transit-oriented development to the much needed areas of West Baltimore that have been disinvested in and underdeveloped for so long. So Elijah, certainly working with others, fought for 10 years and got the money. The red line was ready to be, launched in terms of breaking ground when the governor of the state of Maryland actually shut down the project, snatched the money, gave the federal money back to the feds, and then took the rest of the money and doled it out to highway projects around the state. None of that money went to the city of Baltimore. So now we're talking about racial equity in transportation. And I am here to tell you that Elijah believed very firmly in equity. And that means that we have to focus on how to leverage the forthcoming, and it's coming at some point soon, hopefully, infrastructure investments to make sure that there are extra resources that go to the areas of our country that have been disinvested in, particularly communities where Black and brown citizens, residents have who depend on public transportation to survive and thrive. And so, there needs to be an equity strategy in any infrastructure bill. And I encourage all of these wonderful experts that you've heard today to come up with that legislative framework and push it to make sure that this infrastructure bill has what it needs in order to make sure that our communities are taken care of. Now, Elijah is no longer here, but his memory lives on. And I certainly want to thank the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for honoring his memory and his legacy by making sure that today's transportation equity session was conducted in his memory. I'd also like to thank State Farm for supporting this wonderful session today. And certainly Dr. Mena Demise and all of the staff at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for pulling this excellent session together. Congratulations, and thank you very much.